Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Percy Shelley wrote of his young wife in the dedication to Leon and Cythna. They say that thou wert lovely from thy birth, of glorious parents, thou aspiring child. The glorious parents were William Godwin, the leading reformer and radical philosopher of the time, and Mary Wollstonecraft, famed as the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Wollstonecraft had died as the result of childbed fever incurred when she gave birth to Mary. 4 years later, Godwin married a widow, Mary Jane Clairmont, who soon had more than she could cope with, trying to manage a family of 5 children of diverse parentage amid increasing financial difficulties. Mary bitterly resented her stepmother but adored her father, who, she later said, was my God, and I remember many childish instances of the excess of attachment I bore for him. To ease the situation, Mary was sent at the age of 14 to live in Dundee, Scotland, with the family of William Baxter, an admirer of Godwin. After 2 pleasant years roaming the countryside, daydreaming, and writing stories, which have been lost, she returned in 1814 to her father's house in London. There, at the age of 16, she encountered the 21-year-old poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a devotee of Godwin's and an almost daily visitor, who had become estranged from his wife Harriet. The young people fell in love. Within a few months, Mary was pregnant. On July 28, they ran off to Europe, taking with them her stepsister Jane Clairmont, who later changed her name to Claire. Mary described their happy though heedless wanderings through France, Switzerland, and Germany in her first book, History of a 6 Weeks Tour, published anonymously in 1817. Back in England, she gave premature birth to a daughter who lived only 12 days. A year later, in 1816, she bore a son, William. Shelley was usually in financial difficulties and often had to hide from his creditors to avoid arrest. Nonetheless, he contributed substantial sums, borrowed against his expectations as heir to his father, Sir Timothy, to Godwin's support, even though Godwin, despite his earlier advocacy of free love, refused to countenance Shelley's liaison with his daughter. Claire Clairmont, meanwhile, sought out and had a brief affair with Byron, who left her pregnant. In the spring of 1816, the Shelleys went abroad again with Claire, and at the latter's behest settled in Geneva, where Byron, accompanied by his physician and friend John William Polidori, set up residence in the nearby Villa Diodati. Mary Shelley tells us, in the introduction to Frankenstein, how her imagination was fired by their animated conversations during many social evenings. Encouraged and assisted by Shelley, she wrote Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, her story of the man of science who, with catastrophic consequences, seeks to conquer nature, rival the divinity, and make new life, and who then withholds love from the life he has made. Since its anonymous publication in 1818, the novel has never been out of print. As the basis for innumerable plays, beginning in 1823, and movies, beginning in 1910, the story has become a central myth of modern Western culture. The last 6 years of Mary's life with her husband, spent first in England and then in Italy, were filled with disasters. In October 1816, her sensitive and moody half-sister, Fanny Imlay, feeling herself an unloved burden on the Godwin household, committed suicide by an overdose of laudanum. 2 months later, Shelley's abandoned wife Harriet, pregnant by an unknown lover, drowned herself in the Serpentine Lake at Hyde Park in London. Shelley at once married Mary, but the courts denied him custody of Harriet's 2 children on the grounds that he was morally unfit to rear them. In September 1818 came the death of Mary's 3rd baby, Clara, followed less than 9 months later by the death from malaria, rampant in Rome at the time, of her adored son William. "We came to Italy thinking to do Shelley's health good," Mary wrote bitterly, "but the climate is not by any means warm enough to be of benefit to him, and yet it is that has destroyed my 2 children." These tragedies and her own ill health threw her into a depression that was only partly relieved by the birth of a second son, Percy Florence, in November 1819, and was deepened again the next spring by a miscarriage, as well as by the death of Claire's daughter, Allegra, whom Byron had placed in an Italian convent. Mary Shelley's habitual reserve, which masked the depth of her feelings, now became an apathy that caused her to withdraw emotionally from her husband. He became distant in turn, giving their friend Jane Williams the affection he denied his wife. When he was drowned in the Gulf of Spezia in July 1822, Mary was left with a persisting sense that she had failed her husband when he most needed her. An impoverished widow of 24, she returned to England with two ambitions. One was to disseminate the poetry and to rescue the character of Shelley, whom she idolized in memory. The other was to support, by her writings, her surviving son. Her only financial assistance was a small allowance given her by Sir Timothy Shelley, which he threatened to cut off if she wrote a biography of his radical and scandal-haunted son. In the remaining quarter-century of her life, Mary Shelley became a notable success as a professional woman of letters, publishing as the author of Frankenstein to comply with Sir Timothy's demand that she never use the Shelley name. After Frankenstein, she wrote first a novella and then 5 more novels, of which the first 2 are the best. The novella Matilda, written in 1819 but left in manuscript and not published until 1959, deals with the disastrous results of a father's incestuous passion for a daughter who resembles his dead wife. Valperga, 1823, set in the Italian Middle Ages, is a historical romance about a quasi-Napoleonic figure who sacrifices his love and humanity to his lust for political power, and about the 2 women whom he betrays. The Last Man, 1826, set in the 21st century, tracing the progress of a plague that destroys all of humankind except for one survivor, the novel's narrator, almost equals Frankenstein in its analysis of human isolation. This novel also served Shelley as a forum in which to write autobiographically, for as she reflected in a diary entry, her own companions, like her ever-mourning narrators, were gone, become the people of the grave. She in fact arranged to endow 2 characters in the novel, her narrator's associates, with traits recognizably those of Percy Shelley and Byron, whose death in Greece occurred as she began writing. Shelley all this while also contributed short stories to the gift books and literary annuals that were a publishing phenomenon during the 1820s and 1830s, deluxe volumes, gorgeously bound and lavishly illustrated, whose literary selections mingled pieces by esteemed authors, Scott, Hemans, Wordsworth, Coleridge, with contributions by the most fashionable members of the aristocracy. All writers, however, were by the makers of gift books deemed less important than the visual artists. The stories or poems were often commissioned to accompany pre-existing illustrations. In 1835-39, she contributed to the Cabinet Encyclopedia 5 volumes of admirable biographical and critical studies of continental authors. She also published several separate editions of her husband's writings in verse and prose. In accordance with what was then standard editorial procedure, she altered and amended Shelley's texts. She also added prefaces and notes relating Shelley's writings to the circumstances of his life and thought that have been an important resource for scholars of Romantic literature. Not until old Sir Timothy died in 1844, leaving his title and estate to her son, did she find herself in comfortable circumstances. Her last years were cheered by the devotion of her son, who was an amiable man but entirely lacked the genius of his parents, and by her close relationship with Jane St. John, an admirer of Shelley's poetry, whom Sir Percy Florence married in 1848. Mary Shelley died 3 years later, at the age of 53. During her widowhood, she craved social acceptance and status and, although she maintained liberal principles, tried hard, by adapting herself to conventional standards in her writings and her life, to work free from the onus of what her contemporaries regarded as the scandalous careers of her mother, father, and husband. In later life, she wrote an apologia in her journal, dated October 21, 1838, that reveals the stresses of a life spent trying to measure up to the example, yet escape the bad reputations, of her parents and husband. In the first place, with regard to the good cause, the cause of the advancement of freedom and knowledge, of the rights of women, etc., I am not a person of opinions. Some have a passion for reforming the world, others do not cling to particular opinions. That my parents and Shelley were of the former class makes me respect it. For myself, I earnestly desire the good and enlightenment of my fellow creatures, and see all, in the present course, tending to the same, and rejoice. But I am not for violent extremes, which only brings on an injurious reaction. To hang back, as I do, brings a penalty. I was nursed and fed with a love of glory. To be something great and good was the precept given me by my father. Shelley reiterated it, but Shelley died, and I was alone. My total friendlessness, my horror of pushing, and inability to put myself forward unless led, cherished, and supported, all this has sunk me in a state of loneliness no other human being ever before, I believe, endured, except Robinson Crusoe. But I have never crouched to society, never sought it unworthily. If I have never ridden to vindicate the rights of women, I have ever defended women when oppressed. At every risk I have befriended and supported victims to the social system, but I make no boast, for in truth it is simple justice I perform, and so am I still reviled for being worldly. Such as I have written appears to me the exact truth.